Our first reading is taken from John, chapter 15, verses 9 to 17. I love you just as the Father loves me. Remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My commandment is this: love one another just as I love you. The greatest love a person can have for his friends is to give his life for them. And you are my friends. If you do what I command you, I do not call you servants any longer, because a servant does not know what his master is doing. Instead, I call you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me. I chose you and appointed you to go and bear much fruit, the kind of fruit that endures. And so the Father will give you whatever you ask for him in my name. This, then, is what I command you: love one another.
And now it's my great joy to introduce to you Richard Meredith, one of the readers here at St Mary's. And Richard's going to share with you some great stories for Remembrance Sunday.
On this Remembrance Sunday, greetings to you all from our home, with the words of Jesus ringing hopefully in our ears from our Gospel reading: love one another. There is no greater thing to do but to lay down one's life for one's friends. And with the hymn, the first verse, which we've just sung, speaks of the stormy blasts and God as our helper, and as our hope, and as our home. And so I want just to speak briefly of living under three shadows: the shadow of the pandemic, the shadow of the swastika, and the shadow of the cross. The shadow of the pandemic, the swastika, and the cross. Obviously today our thoughts are those who have been in conflicts and in wars. But let us just for a moment think of this pandemic, the shadow on which we live, which provides for us all, in one way or another, lives which are hit by stormy blasts. Not always stormy, but certainly blasts. And we should not forget not only those who have died in the care through being doctors or nurses or carers or in other ways, but also for the very many who have risked their lives in loving others and we are thankful, have been able to survive and carry on. But today we do think much more of those living under the shadow of the swastika, and we give thanks for those whose lives were sacrificed and for the many who came back. And of course we've all seen these marvellous television programmes, the Battle of Britain, the Normandy landings, so moving and so marvellous, such a superb programme. And the programmes also from the various war memorials in France and in Belgium, for those who went in order to give thanks to their comrades, and we are thankful that they were able to come back, not least the famous Captain Tom. But I want just to draw your attention for a moment to my sister-in-law, who is German. She was born in 1921 and died in 2009. She was born the only child of parents in Berlin. Her mother was half Jewish, but neither parents had any kind of religious association or belief. They were very definitely atheists. And Laura was brought up in that atmosphere. There was one occasion, in fact, when her father went completely berserk and had a gun in his hand, a pistol in his hand, and she had to seize it in order to prevent the family being damaged and from father damaging himself. As I say, she was the only child, but she was blessed with great intelligence. She excelled in science. She excelled in languages. She could have been a doctor, that's what she wanted to be. But of course, she was not allowed any move to higher education because being a quarter Jewish herself, she was regarded as one of the non-Aryans, that group of people who, as she describes in her autobiography, were racially impure. So what did she have to do? She was forced to go to an agricultural camp, work hard on the most menial tasks of coping with the earth closets. When she'd finished that, she managed to get herself a place with a small theatre touring company and went to Russia and Ukraine. But there was one thing, or two things really, which she had. Her grandmother, on her mother's side, did occasionally come to look after her while the parents were away. And her grandmother, at age 3, taught her the Lord's Prayer, and before her parents came back, she made sure that Laura knew the Lord's Prayer by heart. And then in the primary school, remember that her parents voted for Hitler because that was a safe thing to do. Remember too that she and her parents and everyone had to shout Heil Hitler, and she had to wear a Nazi uniform. But there was a teacher who, within the regulations, was able to convey Bible stories, and these she never forgot. And so in her autobiography here, Under the Shadow of the Swastika, which is a deeply moving account of her life in Germany and later, in her autobiography she wrote these words: "I knew in my heart with an unfailing certainty that God was real and present in my life, and that he would not let me go." So that is one of the reasons why I passionately believe in education, teaching people about Jesus, not in any sense evangelizing, teaching people about Jesus, giving them the opportunity to know about him, about his love. And that obviously had an impression upon Laura and lasted throughout her life. So the next blast in her life was back in Berlin. The Russians were about to take over that part of Berlin, and she didn't want, and her parents didn't want her to live under communism. So she decided and moved in her mid-20s. She walked, she took trains, and she landed up in the north of Germany in a town called Kiel, where she did a revision course in English and found herself as an interpreter in the Nazi war trials in Kiel. And who should turn up but Padre Michael Meredith, who invited her to come to his talks on Christian doctrine. She said, "I didn't know anything about Christian doctrine," and I went to his talks, and he invited her to help run the work amongst the young people in the army garrison there. And the rest is history, because they married and then had 40 years of parish ministry, both active in this country and also for a short time in Jamaica, in this country, in London, in the Midlands and in the North, and also in Wales. And she writes again about her life before that time. As the storm clouds gathered fast, I did not make special time for God, but I knew that he was present in all my life. And so however sceptical we may be, and I certainly am, about whether God is at work, here is an example of somebody who clung on to the fact that God was at work, and she was convinced about it and allowed him to teach her as the opportunity arose. Life under the pandemic, under the cross, life under the shadow of the pandemic, life under the shadow of the swastika, but life also under the shadow of the cross. And you see here on my right a representation of a Sudanese cross, because the Sudanese people were one country until 2012, when South Sudan, which is mainly Christian, became independent. And the Christians in Sudan suffered under much attack. And they made the cross, which you see there, my representation simply made out of a bamboo cane with yellow tape round it. That was the cross that they carried, made out of ebony, and the cartridges of the bullets which were killing many of their people. And they carried this cross as a sign that the cross was central, but the cross was not the end. Now you remember, do you not, that in one occasion in the scriptures, Jesus was explaining more than one occasion to his disciples that he must die and must rise again. And what happened? Peter said, no, nonsense, Lord, that's not rubbish. That's not going to happen. Jesus took Peter aside and said to him these words, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." And this Sudanese cross was made by one Sudanese, Philip Maxwell, out of the noses of MiG jet fighters which had been shot down. And he made a cross with the four noses pointing to one another, and between these four noses, Jesus on the cross. And he said, this is our sign of the cross of Jesus, but a cross which leads to hope in the resurrection and to home in the life beyond. And I just want to show you now how this cross looks, which the Sudanese carry. A photograph taken by the Church Mission Society when I was one of their area coordinators. But notice, please, I have fixed it on to a calendar which I still have beside my desk of 1997, because it demonstrates a Sudanese youngster, very thin, and if I remove the cross, a very thin, emaciated body. And I tell you that I have just heard last week that 800,000 Sudanese have been made homeless, not this time by war, by MiG jet fighters, but by a huge, great flood. Homes destroyed and food very difficult. And Sudan, despite the fact that it is now independent, is still sadly racked by tribal differences between the Dinkas and the Nuers and others. And it's not a very safe place for our aid workers. So we need to pray for them and continue to support them. But I want to close by just reminding and remembering somebody, a very distinguished man, David Knott. If you listen to Desert Island Discs, you will have heard him 2 or 3 weeks ago, speaking of his work. He's he qualified as a surgeon, went out to Syria and was so appalled that he could not put Syria out of his mind, and spent many years in Syria working as a surgeon in the most impossible situations without proper buildings, and then in Afghanistan, and then in Iraq, and then in Iraq, and then in Iran. A remarkable man who married, then had children. His wife said to him, "David, do you not think that we might do something better than just risking your life and possibly being killed? Why do you not now set up, and why do we not now set up, a course of training for surgeons in these various countries?" And that is exactly what they have done, training surgeons to do the work which he, as one man, had been doing, and so it is spread to so many. Now, David Knott was invited to lunch with the Queen, and she turned to him at his turn to talk to the Queen, and he could say nothing because he was so traumatized and so upset by what he was constantly having to remember. So what did the Queen do? She summoned one of her servants and said, "Bring me the corgis." And she brought the corgis, and she fed half a biscuit to the corgis and gave the other half to David, and he fed the half biscuit to the corgis, and they had a marvellous time together. And the Queen said to him afterwards, "Yeah, being with animals and feeding the animals is better than too much talking, isn't it?" And so as we hear the last words of Jesus in the reading we had, love one another, may I just suggest that when we are with people who are traumatized, when we are with people who are bereaved, it may not be the talking that we need to do. In fact, it may not be the talking at all. It may be the listening. But it may be that if you've got a dog, take your dog with you and allow the dog to be the means of communication. Now, David's favourite hymn concluded Desert Island Discs. And I hope that this may be the hymn which is going to be sung now. Love divine, all loves excelling. Amen.